By the autumn of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had entered its second full year. German forces, having failed to defeat the Soviet Union in 1941, launched a renewed offensive in the south during the summer of 1942. This campaign, known as Case Blue, aimed to seize oil fields in the Caucasus and disrupt Soviet industrial capacity. The city of Stalingrad, located on the western bank of the Volga River, became a focal point of German operations. German military records indicate that the city's industrial facilities, river traffic, and name made it a target of both military and political significance. By September 1942, the German 6th Army, supported by elements of the 4th Panzer Army, was engaged in prolonged urban fighting inside the city. At the same time, German flanks north and south of Stalingrad were held largely by Axis allied forces, including Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. German Army Group B war diaries document concerns about the strength and equipment of these formations, particularly their limited anti-tank capability. Soviet leadership monitored these developments closely. Stavka records show that by September and October 1942, Soviet planners had concluded that a direct counterattack within the city would be costly and uncertain. Instead, they began preparing a large-scale counteroffensive aimed at encircling German forces at Stalingrad by striking their weaker flanks. This documentary examines Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive launched in November 1942, and the subsequent encirclement and destruction of the German 6th Army. It draws on Soviet General Staff reports, German 6th Army records, and post-war historical analyses. Documented facts are presented separately from historian interpretations, and all figures and outcomes are based on verified archival sources. By early November 1942, the German 6th Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was deeply committed to fighting inside Stalingrad. German operational maps show that much of the Army's strength was concentrated in urban combat zones along the Volga River, north of Stalingrad. The German left flank was held primarily by the Romanian 3rd Army, south of the city. The Romanian 4th Army covered extended positions along the steppe. These formations were equipped mainly with light artillery and limited numbers of anti-tank weapons. Documented fact: German records acknowledge that Romanian units lacked sufficient modern anti-tank guns to counter Soviet armored formations effectively. German High Command was aware of the vulnerability of these flanks. Correspondence between Army Group B and the German Army High Command indicates repeated requests for reinforcement. However, German resources were heavily committed elsewhere, including the Caucasus. Inside Stalingrad, conditions deteriorated steadily. German 6th Army reports describe shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies as Soviet artillery and air attacks disrupted supply routes. Soviet defenders continued to hold narrow positions along the riverbank, maintaining ferry crossings that brought reinforcements across the Volga. Historian interpretation. Many historians argue that German fixation on capturing the city diverted attention from the broader operational situation. While urban fighting absorbed German strength, Soviet forces retained freedom of maneuver on the flanks. By mid-November 1942, German command expected a Soviet winter offensive, but anticipated it would be directed at the city itself rather than the flanks. This assessment influenced German defensive preparations. Soviet planning for Operation Uranus was conducted under the direction of the Stavka, the Soviet High Command. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, and General Aleksandr Vasilevsky played central roles in developing the operation, documented in Stavka directives. The plan called for a double envelopment. Soviet forces would strike the Axis flanks north and south of Stalingrad, then advance toward the town of Kalach on the Don River, where German supply lines converged. Documented fact: Soviet General Staff reports list approximately 1.1 million personnel allocated to the operation, supported by 894 tanks, 13,451 artillery pieces, and over 1,100 aircraft. The operation relied on secrecy and deception. Soviet records describe measures to conceal troop movements, including nighttime rail transport and camouflage. Dummy positions were constructed near the city to reinforce the impression of a direct assault. Soviet commanders identified Romanian forces as the primary targets. Intelligence summaries indicated that these units were overstretched and inadequately equipped to resist armored attacks. Historian interpretation: scholars such as David M. Glantz emphasize that Operation Uranus reflected growing Soviet operational maturity, combining intelligence, logistics, and coordination across multiple fronts. By mid-November, Soviet units were positioned for attack. Artillery concentrations were established, and tank formations were assembled behind the front lines. Final orders were issued shortly before the offensive began. Operation Uranus began on the morning of the 19th of November 1942. Soviet Southwestern Front and Don Front forces launched a coordinated assault against the Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad. Documented fact: Soviet artillery bombardments preceded the ground attack, targeting Romanian defensive positions and command centers. German and Romanian records confirm that the Romanian Third Army was unable to halt the Soviet advance. Soviet tank corps penetrated the defensive lines within hours, exploiting gaps created by artillery fire. By the 20th of November, Soviet armored units had advanced deep into the rear areas of German forces. Communications between German headquarters and frontline units were disrupted, complicating response efforts. German 6th Army War Diaries note increasing concern as reports of breakthroughs accumulated. Attempts to redeploy German armored reserves were delayed by distance and fuel shortages. Historian interpretation: many historians argue that the collapse of the Romanian Third Army was decisive in opening the northern corridor of the encirclement. The Soviet advance continued westward toward the Don River crossings, aiming to link up with forces attacking from the south. On the 20th of November, 1942, Soviet Stalingrad Front forces launched the southern arm of Operation Uranus against the Romanian Fourth Army. Documented fact: similar to the northern assault, Soviet forces achieved rapid breakthroughs due to superior armor and artillery support. German records indicate that Romanian defenses collapsed within a day. Soviet tank units advanced toward Kalach, capturing key crossings over the Don River. On the 22nd and the 23rd of November, Soviet forces from the north and south met near Kalach, completing the encirclement of German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army. Documented fact: approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Axis personnel were trapped inside the encirclement according to German and Soviet records. Inside the pocket, German commanders reported shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. Air supply was proposed as a solution. Historian interpretation: Historians note that the decision to rely on air supply underestimated logistical realities, particularly winter weather and Soviet air defenses. Following the encirclement, Adolf Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold its positions and promised resupply by air. German Luftwaffe records document efforts to deliver supplies using transport aircraft. Documented fact: the Luftwaffe was unable to deliver the required daily tonnage needed to sustain Sixth Army operations. Weather conditions, aircraft losses, and limited airfield capacity reduced effectiveness. Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols further disrupted flights. German attempts to break the encirclement from the outside, including Operation Winter Storm in December 1942, failed to reach the pocket. Historian interpretation: military historians argue that the decision not to authorize an early breakout contributed significantly to the eventual surrender. Inside the encirclement, German medical reports describe rising casualties from wounds, illness, and exposure. In January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Ring to eliminate the encircled German forces. Soviet General Staff reports document systematic attacks supported by artillery and armor. German resistance weakened steadily. Ammunition shortages, limited defensive fire, and organized resistance became increasingly localized. On the 31st of January 1943, General Friedrich Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the encirclement. The remaining northern forces surrendered on the 2nd of February 1943. Documented fact: approximately 91,000. German soldiers were taken prisoner, including 22 generals. Soviet casualty figures indicate heavy losses, though Soviet forces maintained numerical superiority throughout the operation. Historian interpretation: scholars emphasize that the destruction of Sixth Army marked the first complete annihilation of a German field army during the war. The defeat at Stalingrad had significant military consequences. German forces retreated across much of the southern front in early 1943. Documented fact: Soviet forces seized the strategic initiative and conducted successive offensives later in the year. German records reflect declining morale and increasing defensive posture following the defeat. Allied intelligence assessments identified Stalingrad as a major shift in the balance of power. Historian interpretation: while the war continued for more than 2 years, many historians view Stalingrad as a turning point due to its scale and impact on German operational capacity. Operation Uranus and the encirclement at Stalingrad represent a major operational success for the Soviet armed forces. Documented Soviet planning, combined with German and Axis vulnerabilities, resulted in the destruction of the German Sixth Army. The operation demonstrated improved Soviet coordination, logistics, and command capability. German records confirm that the loss of personnel and equipment at Stalingrad could not be fully replaced. Historian interpretation consistently emphasizes that the encirclement shifted momentum on the Eastern Front, though it did not immediately end the war. This documentary has presented documented facts, figures, and outcomes based on archival records and scholarly research. The events at Stalingrad remain a central subject of military history due to their scale and lasting strategic consequences.